My name is Bailey Thompson, 65 years old, and recently retired from 40 years in construction. The house I built with my own two hands, where I raised my daughter Jessica after my wife passed, suddenly became her ATM. When Jessica demanded I sell my home to fund her $150,000 Santorini wedding, I felt my heart stop. The entitlement in her eyes was something I had never seen before. What she never expected was that I already had a plan of my own. Before I tell you how I stood up for myself after decades of sacrifice, let me know where you are watching from and hit that subscribe button if you value hard work over entitlement. I grew up in Oak Ridge, a small town in the Midwest, where most folks worked with their hands and took pride in what they built. My father was a carpenter who taught me everything about craftsmanship, integrity, and the value of creating something that lasts. By 16, I could frame a wall better than men twice my age. Those skills became the foundation of not just my career, but my entire life. During my junior year of high school, I met Margaret Davis in chemistry class. She had auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire, and a laugh that could brighten the darkest room. Unlike the other girls who barely noticed me, Margaret appreciated that I could fix things. Our first date wasn't to the movies or a dance. I helped her rebuild her grandfather's broken porch steps. By the time we finished, covered in sawdust and sweat, I knew she was the one. We married right after graduation in 1978. Neither of us had money for college, so I apprenticed with a local construction company while Margaret worked as a receptionist at the town medical clinic. We lived in a tiny apartment above the hardware store, saving every penny we could. Our dream was simple but powerful: to own land and build our home with our own hands. By the time I turned 25, we had scraped together $12,000. Every overtime hour, every skipped dinner out, every birthday and Christmas gift from our families had gone into that savings account. It was enough to buy 3 acres on the edge of town with a view of the rolling hills to the west. The land wasn't much to look at, overgrown with brambles and a few scraggly trees, but to us, it was everything. "This is where our children will grow up," Margaret said the day we signed the papers, her eyes bright with tears and possibility. I still remember the first weekend we cleared the land. Margaret and I working side by side, pulling weeds and marking the foundation lines. I had drawn up simple plans, nothing fancy, just a 2-story farmhouse style with a wide front porch where we could watch the sunset. My boss let me use the company's equipment on weekends, and fellow workers would sometimes stop by to lend a hand. For 3 years, I worked on our house every evening after my regular job and all weekend long. Margaret would bring sandwiches and iced tea, helping where she could, holding boards steady, mixing concrete, painting walls. The progress was slow but steady. Every nail driven, every wall raised, was an act of love. Jessica came along in 1984, right as we were finishing the second floor. Margaret gave birth at the hospital on a Tuesday, and by Saturday, I had the nursery walls painted a soft yellow. I built Jessica's crib myself, sanding each spindle until it was smooth as silk. When we brought our baby girl home, the house wasn't fully finished. We still needed to complete the kitchen cabinets and install proper flooring in some rooms, but it was ours. As Jessica grew, so did our home. I added a treehouse when she was 6, a proper deck off the kitchen when she was 10, and converted the attic into a bedroom for her 13th birthday. Every improvement was marked by Jessica's height penciled on the kitchen doorframe, the physical growth of our daughter matched by the evolution of our home. Then came the worst day of my life. Margaret complained of headaches for weeks before finally seeing a doctor. The diagnosis: stage 4, brain cancer, terminal. Jessica was 14, just starting high school. Margaret fought hard for 2 years, but cancer is merciless. She made me promise 2 things before she passed: to finish the garden she had planned, with roses along the south fence, and to make sure Jessica went to college. Raising a teenage daughter alone was the hardest job I ever tackled. Grief made Jessica withdrawn and angry. I worked overtime to afford a therapist, took off early on Wednesdays to attend her swim meets, and stayed up late learning to make the chocolate chip cookies Margaret used to bake. We stumbled through those years together, the house becoming our sanctuary and the physical embodiment of Margaret's memory. Jessica gradually healed. By her senior year, she had become an excellent student with her sights set on attending State University to study marketing. When her acceptance letter arrived, I took out a second mortgage on the house to cover what scholarships wouldn't. Margaret's second wish would be fulfilled. Those college years strained my finances to the breaking point. I took on side jobs, sold my fishing boat, and postponed necessary home repairs. Jessica rarely came home during breaks, preferring to travel with friends or take unpaid internships in the city. I told myself this was good. She was building her own life, making connections, preparing for her future. After graduation, Jessica landed a job with a marketing firm in Chicago. I was so proud watching her walk across that stage, knowing Margaret would have been beaming. Jessica seemed to be thriving in the city, though her visits home became even more infrequent. Just Christmas and maybe a weekend in the summer. During those brief visits, she would comment on how rustic the house was, suggesting renovations I could neither afford nor wanted. As I approached retirement, I finally began to think about my own dreams again. I converted Margaret's sewing room into a proper workshop where I could build furniture. I drew up plans to expand the garden and add a greenhouse. I researched fishing spots along the coast where I might spend a week or two each year. After decades of putting everyone else first, I allowed myself to imagine a peaceful retirement doing the things I loved. Then came Jessica's phone call that changed everything. "Dad, I have amazing news." Her voice bubbled with excitement. Anthony proposed. "We're engaged." Anthony Parker was an investment banker. Jessica had been dating for about a year. I had met him only once, during a brief dinner when they passed through town on their way to a ski resort. He seemed polite enough, if a bit distracted by his phone throughout the meal. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said, genuinely happy for her. "When do you think the wedding might be?" "We're thinking next summer. June would be perfect," she replied. "And Dad, it's going to be beautiful. Anthony has connections. We're planning something really special." I assured her I would help however I could, imagining a modest contribution toward a reasonable wedding. Margaret and I had married in her parents' backyard with homemade food and borrowed chairs, but times had changed, and I understood modern weddings were more elaborate affairs. "I'll come visit soon," Jessica promised. "We have so much to plan, and I want you to be part of it all." I hung up the phone feeling hopeful. Perhaps this wedding would bring us closer again. Maybe Anthony would be the son I never had. I even entertained thoughts of grandchildren visiting, playing in the same yard where their mother had once built snowmen and chased fireflies. Little did I know that Jessica's idea of me being part of it all was far different from what I imagined. The doorbell rang on a Sunday afternoon in early October. The maple trees lining my driveway were turning brilliant shades of orange and red, and I had spent the morning raking leaves into piles that the neighborhood kids would later jump in. Opening the door, I found Jessica and Anthony standing on my porch, both dressed in what I assumed was the latest big city fashion. Him in a tailored blue blazer that probably cost more than my monthly pension, and her in some kind of flowing white outfit that seemed impractical for the autumn chill. Surprise. Jessica threw her arms around me. We thought we'd drive out and share all our exciting plans in person. I welcomed them in, hurriedly clearing newspapers from the living room sofa and putting on coffee. Jessica wrinkled her nose at the mug I handed her, one of Margaret's old ceramic ones with a chip on the handle, but took it anyway. "So, Dad," she began, setting down a leather portfolio on the coffee table. "We've been working with the most amazing wedding planner. Sophia has done events for actual celebrities, but she agreed to take us on because Anthony's firm manages investments for her brother." Anthony nodded, adding, "We wanted something truly memorable, not just for us, but for our guests. An experience they'll talk about for years." Jessica flipped open the portfolio to reveal glossy photos of whitewashed buildings against a backdrop of the most intensely blue water I had ever seen. "Santorini," she said, her eyes shining. "The most beautiful island in Greece. White buildings, blue domes, sunset views over the caldera. It's absolute perfection." For the next 30 minutes, they showed me images of clifftop venues, luxury villas, and elaborate flower arrangements. They talked about flying 40 guests over for a 4-day celebration, chartering boats for a sunset cruise, and hiring local musicians for the reception. I nodded and smiled, trying to share their enthusiasm, while a knot of unease grew in my stomach. Finally, Anthony cleared his throat and said, "The total package comes to around $150,000. A bargain, really, considering what we're getting." I nearly choked on my coffee. 150,000? That's more than this house cost to build. Jessica leaned forward, taking my hand in hers. "Dad, that's actually what we wanted to talk to you about. We've been looking at your options, and really, this house is way too big for just you now." "My options?" I repeated, not quite understanding. "The real estate market is really strong right now," Anthony interjected. "Properties in this area are selling within days of listing. A place like this, with the land, you could easily get 300,000, maybe more." The room seemed to tilt slightly as their meaning became clear. "You want me to sell my house? To pay for your wedding?" "Dad, you always said you wanted me to have the best," Jessica said, her voice taking on a tone I recognized from her teenage years when she wanted something expensive. "And honestly, wouldn't Mom have wanted that too? For her only daughter to have the wedding of her dreams?" The mention of Margaret sent a jolt through me. "Your mother would have wanted you to be happy, yes, but she also valued practicality. We built this house together, Jessica. Every board, every nail." Jessica waved her hand dismissively. "I know, Dad, but it's just a house. You could get something much more suitable for your age. A nice condo maybe, with no maintenance. No stairs to worry about as you get older." Before I could respond, Anthony pulled out his tablet and began showing me a presentation they had prepared. Slides comparing my current property taxes to those of nearby condominiums, maintenance costs, even a graph projecting the appreciation of different housing types over the next decade. "We've already put deposits down on the venue and photographer," Jessica added. "They were about to be booked by someone else, so we had to move quickly. 10,000, non-refundable." My head was spinning. "You put down deposits? Before talking to me?" "We knew you'd want to help," Jessica said confidently. "You've always supported my dreams." Anthony glanced at his watch. "We should probably wrap this up soon. We have dinner reservations back in the city at 8. I need time to think about this," I managed to say. Jessica frowned slightly but nodded. "Of course, Dad. But we do need to confirm everything with Sophia by the end of the month. The vendors in Santorini book up so quickly." They left shortly after, leaving behind their portfolio for me to look through. Jessica hugged me tightly at the door and whispered, "This means so much to me, Dad. It'll be the perfect start to our lives together." After their car disappeared down the driveway, I walked through my house in a daze, touching the walls, the door frames, the banister I had carved by hand. In the attic that had once been Jessica's teenage bedroom, I found a box of old photographs, Margaret and me breaking ground on the foundation, Jessica taking her first steps across the living room floor, the three of us planting the maple saplings that now towered over the driveway. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the porch swing Margaret and I had hung together 30 years ago, watching the stars and trying to imagine leaving the only home I had known for most of my adult life. The idea felt like a physical pain in my chest, as if someone was asking me to cut off a limb. What would Margaret say? Would she think I was being selfish for not wanting to give our daughter the wedding of her dreams? Or would she be appalled at Jessica's request? The Margaret I knew valued experiences over possessions, relationships over appearances. Our own wedding had cost less than $500, but we had been surrounded by love. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, I still had no answer, only a deep sense of disappointment that the daughter we raised could ask such a thing of me. The calls began the very next day, Jessica phoning with the contact information for florists, photographers, caterers. Each conversation started with her breathless excitement about some new detail and inevitably circled back to whether I had made arrangements to list the house yet. "The wedding is only 8 months away, Dad," she reminded me during one call. "Real estate transactions can take time, especially if the buyer needs financing." To appease her, I contacted a local real estate agent, Linda Morales, who had sold several properties in the neighborhood. I presented it as a casual inquiry about the current market value, But Linda was sharp enough to sense my reluctance. Mind if I ask why you're considering selling, Bailey? You've put so much of yourself into this place. I explained the situation, feeling embarrassed as I admitted my daughter wanted me to fund her extravagant wedding. Linda's expression softened with sympathy. That's a big ask. Would you like me to put you in touch with my brother? He's a financial advisor. Might be good to talk through the implications before making any decisions. I met with her brother, Tom Morales, the following week. He reviewed my retirement accounts, pension, and the equity in my home, then looked at me seriously over his reading glasses. Bailey, I'm going to be blunt. Liquidating your major asset to fund a one-day event would be financially devastating. You'd need to find new housing, likely with a mortgage that would stretch well into your 80s. Your retirement funds aren't substantial enough to make up the difference. But it's for my daughter's wedding, I said weakly, already knowing in my heart that he was right. Let me ask you this, Tom replied. If your daughter came to you asking for $150,000 to start a business, fund her education, or put a down payment on a home, would you feel differently? The question hit me like a bucket of cold water. Of course I would. Those would be investments in Jessica's future, not a lavish party. While I was still processing this realization, Jessica escalated matters by bringing her future in-laws to see the house. They arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning, while I was in my workshop cutting pieces for a birdhouse. Dad, Jessica called from the front door. Come meet Anthony's parents. Harold and Diana Parker were exactly what I would have expected. Polished, reserved, and radiating the quiet confidence of old money. Diana wore pearls to a casual weekend visit, and Harold's handshake was brisk and impersonal. What a quaint place, Diana commented, running a finger along the mantel I had built above the fireplace. So much character. Bailey built it himself, Jessica explained, though her tone suggested this was somewhat embarrassing rather than impressive. Really? Harold raised an eyebrow. Quite the handyman. They toured the house like prospective buyers, commenting on the potential of various spaces and the charming, outdated features that could be easily modernized. I followed behind them, increasingly uncomfortable as they discussed my home as if I weren't present. As they inspected the backyard, I overheard Diana speaking quietly to Jessica by the rose bushes Margaret had planted. Once the sale goes through, you could flip this property quite nicely. The land alone is valuable, and a developer might pay premium to build several modern homes here. I know, Jessica replied. We've already spoken to a developer who's interested. The money from the wedding would just be the start. My blood ran cold. They weren't just asking me to fund the wedding. They were planning to profit further from the sale of my home, the home where Margaret had taken her last breath, the garden where her roses still bloomed every summer. That evening, I called Jessica directly, determined to set some boundaries. Sweetheart, I've given this a lot of thought. I can contribute $20,000 toward your wedding. That's a significant amount and should help with many of the expenses. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought we might have been disconnected. 20,000? Jessica finally said, her voice tight. Dad, that barely covers the flowers and photographer. What about the venue? The flights? The accommodations? Those are expenses you and Anthony should consider carefully. Perhaps a local wedding would be more practical. Practical? She spat the word like it was poison. Is that what you want for your only daughter? Practical? Mom would have wanted better for me. Jessica, your mother would have wanted you to live within your means, to value what matters. You know what matters? Families supporting each other, being there for the important moments. Her voice broke, and I could tell she was crying. I guess you never really loved me enough to want the best for me. The accusation struck me like a physical blow. That's not fair, Jessica. I've always put you first. If that were true, we wouldn't be having this conversation. She hung up. 3 days later, Anthony called. His tone was conciliatory but condescending. Bailey, I understand your reservations. Change is difficult, especially at your age. But Jessica is devastated. This wedding means everything to her. I offered what I can afford, I replied firmly. Have you considered that at your stage of life, downsizing makes sense regardless? A man your age living alone in a 4-bedroom house? It's inefficient. You could find something more appropriate. One level, no maintenance, closer to medical facilities. The implications were clear. I was being viewed as an elderly burden rather than a person with my own dreams and needs. Anthony, I appreciate your concern for my living situation, but this is my home, and I'll decide if and when to sell it. He sighed as if dealing with a stubborn child. Jessica was afraid you'd be difficult about this. I told her parents often have trouble accepting when their children grow up and start their own traditions. After that conversation, the pressure intensified from all directions. Jessica apparently had called various family members, presenting a version of events that cast me as the villain. My sister in Arizona phoned to ask why I was being so difficult. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years sent an email suggesting I was standing in the way of Jessica's happiness. Only my younger brother, Frank, stood firmly in my corner. A widower himself, he understood the sentimental value of the home I had built. "Stick to your guns, Bailey," he advised during our weekly phone call. "That girl is out of line asking you to give up your home for a party." Margaret would be turning in her grave. The most painful moment came when Jessica called late one night, her voice soft and manipulative in a way that reminded me of how she would ask for things as a teenager. "Dad, remember when Mom was sick, that last week, when she made you promise to take care of me, to make sure I had everything I needed to be happy?" My throat tightened. "I remember. This wedding is part of that promise, Dad. It's the foundation of my new life with Anthony. Mom would want you to do this for me. She would understand what this means." Using Margaret's memory as emotional leverage was a low blow, and we both knew it. I ended the call shortly after, sitting in the dark of my kitchen where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals, feeling more alone than I had in years. The final straw came when the wedding planner, Sophia, contacted me directly. She had a crisp British accent and the efficiency of someone used to dealing with the wealthy. "Mr. Thompson, I'm finalizing the vendor contracts for Jessica and Anthony's Santorini celebration. We'll need the first major payment of $60,000 by next Friday to secure the venue and accommodations." "I'm sorry, but Jessica hasn't discussed this with me," I replied, though I suspected she had deliberately avoided the conversation. "Oh?" Sophia sounded genuinely confused. "I was told you were handling all the financial arrangements. Jessica mentioned you were selling property to fund the celebration. She's been assuring vendors that payment is imminent." It became clear that Jessica had been telling everyone, from her friends to the wedding vendors, that I had already agreed to sell my home and fund the entire extravagant affair. She was creating a situation where I would look like the villain if I backed out now. The manipulation was so blatant, so calculated, that it forced me to see my daughter in a new light. When had she become someone who would use emotional blackmail to get her way? Had I contributed to this sense of entitlement by always trying to give her everything? As I hung up the phone, I felt something shift inside me. The guilt and confusion were replaced by a growing clarity. I would not be selling my home. Not for a wedding, not for anything. And it was time Jessica understood that my love for her did not extend to bankrupting myself for her one-day celebration. The next bombshell dropped during a conversation with Harold Parker's brother, whom I met by chance at the local hardware store. Not recognizing me at first, he freely shared details about the wedding preparations. "Harold and Diana are only covering the rehearsal dinner," he mentioned casually as we both examined different grades of sandpaper. "Pretty standard arrangement, I suppose. Though with their money you'd think they might chip in more." I froze, sandpaper in hand. "I'm sorry. What did you say about Harold and Diana?" He looked up, then recognition dawned on his face. "Oh, you're Jessica's father, right, Bailey?" When I confirmed my identity, he became visibly uncomfortable. I probably shouldn't have said anything. Family politics. You know how at Island. But the information was already out there. Anthony's parents, who lived in a mansion and belonged to country clubs, were contributing only the rehearsal dinner to this extravagant wedding. Meanwhile, I was being pressured to sell my home to cover the rest. This revelation prompted me to do something I had never considered before. I began investigating Jessica's financial situation. With some help from Frank, who was more computer savvy than me, we discovered some disturbing facts. Jessica and Anthony maintained an Instagram account documenting their luxury lifestyle, expensive restaurants, designer clothes, weekend getaways to exclusive resorts. Yet Anthony's position at the investment firm wasn't nearly as senior as Jessica had implied, and her own marketing job, while good, couldn't possibly support the lifestyle they flaunted online. "Look at this." Frank pointed to Jessica's credit report on his computer screen. Maxed out cards, minimum payments. They're living way beyond their means. The Santorini wedding, it seemed, was just another item in a pattern of financial irresponsibility. They wanted the status and admiration without having earned the means to support it. That night, I found myself flipping through our old family photo album. Pictures of Margaret and me on our wedding day filled the first pages. She in a simple white dress her mother had altered. Me in my one good suit. Our reception had been in her parents' backyard, with folding tables borrowed from the church and food prepared by aunts and family friends. The total cost couldn't have been more than $500, but the joy on our faces was priceless. I could almost hear Margaret's voice. We raised her to appreciate value, not price tags. Had we failed so completely in that regard? Or had Jessica been seduced by a world of appearances and status that valued the wrong things? The situation grew even more complicated when Jessica called with an additional request that left me speechless. "Dad, Anthony and I have been looking at houses in Lakeview Estates. It's the perfect neighborhood for us. Great schools for when we have kids. Close to both our offices. There's a beautiful colonial available. But we'd need help with the down payment." "Help with the down payment," I repeated, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Jessica, you're already asking me to sell my home for your wedding." "Well, yes," she replied as if this were perfectly reasonable. "But the wedding money would go to the vendors. This would be separate, maybe another $50,000, just to help us get started in our married life." The audacity was breathtaking. Not only was I expected to fund an extravagant wedding, but now a down payment on a house in an upscale neighborhood too, all while being encouraged to downsize to a small apartment for my own golden years. Seeking clarity, I visited Margaret's grave the following Sunday. The cemetery was peaceful in the morning light, birds singing in the trees that lined the pathways. I sat on the bench beside her headstone, bringing her favorite yellow roses. "I don't know what to do, Maggie," I said aloud, using my old nickname for her. "I want to support Jessica, but this doesn't feel right. This isn't about giving her a nice wedding. It's about funding a lifestyle she hasn't earned." No divine answer came, of course, but the quiet time with my thoughts helped. Margaret and I had built our life together brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. We had taught Jessica the value of hard work and the difference between wants and needs. At what point had those lessons been forgotten? Later that week, I had lunch with my old friend George, whose children had moved across the country years ago. They rarely visited but frequently asked for money. I gave and gave until I had nothing left to give. George confessed over sandwiches at the local diner. Paid for cars, bailed them out of debt, funded business ventures that failed. Now I'm 72 and still working part-time because my retirement fund is gone. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Don't make my mistake, Bailey. There's a difference between supporting your child and enabling behavior that will ultimately hurt them." His words stayed with me as I attended Jessica's bridal shower that weekend, hosted at Anthony's parents' suburban mansion. I felt painfully out of place among the wealthy guests and elaborate decorations. Jessica barely spoke to me, though she made a show of opening my gift, a handcrafted jewelry box I had made in my workshop, with exaggerated appreciation before quickly moving on to more expensive presents. Diana Parker cornered me by the champagne fountain, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Bailey," Jessica mentioned, "there might be some hesitation on your part regarding the financial arrangements for the wedding." "I've offered what I can afford," I replied evenly. She lowered her voice. "Perhaps you don't understand how important this is for their social standing. Anthony has colleagues and clients attending. The impression this wedding makes could affect his entire career trajectory." "Then perhaps Anthony and his colleagues should fund it," I suggested. Diana's expression hardened. "Jessica led us to believe you were more supportive." Throughout the event, I observed how Jessica seemed to be playing a role, laughing too loudly, constantly checking that others noticed her expensive engagement ring, deferring to Diana's opinions on everything. This wasn't the daughter I knew. Or perhaps it was the daughter I hadn't allowed myself to see clearly until now. A minor health scare the following week, chest pains that turned out to be severe indigestion rather than a heart attack, forced me to consider my remaining years more seriously. The emergency room doctor had asked about my stress levels, noting my elevated blood pressure. "Any major life changes or difficulties lately?" he had inquired. I laughed bitterly. "You could say that." At home, I spread out my financial documents on the kitchen table and ran the numbers again. If I sold the house and gave Jessica the money she wanted, I would have barely enough left for a small, one-bedroom apartment. My pension and Social Security would cover basic living expenses, but there would be nothing for emergencies, health issues, or any quality of life in my final years. All the plans I had made for my retirement, the workshop expansion, the garden improvements, the fishing trips, would have to be abandoned. I would be trading the peaceful final chapter I had earned for financial insecurity and a home with no memories or personal connection. The situation reached a breaking point at Jessica and Anthony's engagement party. I drove my 15-year-old pickup truck to the upscale restaurant where the event was held, only to have the valet raise his eyebrows at the vehicle. Inside, Jessica pulled me aside almost immediately. "Dad, couldn't you have borrowed a nicer car? Everyone here drives a Lexus or a Mercedes. Your truck is so embarrassing." Something snapped inside me at that moment. Not in anger, but in clarity. This beautiful young woman, educated and privileged in ways Margaret and I could only have dreamed of, was embarrassed by the vehicle that had carried lumber to build her childhood home, driven her to soccer practices and piano recitals, helped move her into her college dorm. I looked around at the glittering party, the champagne flowing freely, the guests in designer clothes, and suddenly saw it all for what it was: a facade, a performance of wealth and status that had nothing to do with love or family or the values Margaret and I had tried to instill. In the restroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. The man looking back at me had spent his entire adult life putting others first. Margaret during her illness, Jessica through her childhood and education, even my employers who had benefited from my skill and work ethic. When had I last prioritized my own needs and dreams? On the counter beside the sink lay a forgotten brochure for a resort in Santorini, likely belonging to one of the wedding guests. The images of white buildings and blue waters reminded me of the workshop plans I had abandoned, the ones that included a window facing my own blue view, the pond behind my property where herons nested in the spring. In that moment, looking at the parallel images of someone else's dream and my own, I made my decision. I would not be selling my home. Not for a Santorini wedding, not for Jessica's down payment, not for anything. The time had come to choose myself, even if it meant disappointing my daughter. The confrontation I had been dreading finally arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Jessica texted that she and Anthony were stopping by with exciting news. I knew what was coming and steeled myself for the difficult conversation ahead. They arrived looking like a power couple from a glossy magazine. Jessica in a cream-colored business suit, Anthony checking his expensive watch as they walked through the door. Behind them came a third person, a professionally dressed woman carrying a leather portfolio. "Dad, this is Elaine Walsh from Premier Realty," Jessica announced, her voice bright with forced cheer. "She's the best listing agent in the county, and she's agreed to take on your property as a personal favor to Anthony's family." Elaine stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Mr. Thompson, I've already run comps for the area, and I'm confident we can get top dollar for your home, especially with a few strategic updates before listing." I remained standing, making no move to invite them further into the living room. I wasn't aware I had decided to list my home. Jessica laughed as if I'd made a joke. "Dad, we've been discussing this for months. The wedding is coming up fast, and we need to move forward." Anthony pulled documents from his briefcase. "We've taken the liberty of preparing the listing agreement. Elaine thinks we should price at $325,000 to generate maximum interest. The market is hot right now," Elaine added. "We should have multiple offers within days of listing." I looked at the three of them, the real estate agent who saw my home as just another commission, the future son-in-law who viewed me as a financial resource to be tapped, and my daughter, who somehow believed she was entitled to the proceeds of my life's work. "I appreciate you coming by," I said calmly, "but there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not selling my home." Jessica's smile faltered. "Dad, stop joking around. We have deadlines." "I'm not joking, Jessica. I've thought about this carefully, and I won't be selling. I've offered to contribute $20,000 toward your wedding, which is what I can afford without compromising my future." Anthony stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Bailey, perhaps you don't understand the situation. Jessica has made commitments based on your verbal agreement. Vendors have been booked. Guests have made travel arrangements. I never gave any verbal agreement to sell my home," I countered. "I said I needed time to think, and I've thought about it. The answer is no." Jessica's composed facade crumbled. "You can't do this to me. This is my wedding we're talking about. My once-in-a-lifetime special day. A day that will last exactly that one day," I replied. "While selling this house would impact the rest of my life." "You're being selfish." Jessica's voice rose. "After everything you and Mom said about wanting the best for me, wanting the best for you doesn't mean bankrupting myself for an extravagant party. Your mother and I taught you the difference between wants and needs. This Santorini wedding is a want, not a need." Anthony placed a restraining hand on Jessica's arm, his tone shifting to something more threatening. "Bailey, you should consider the long-term implications of your decision. Jessica and I will be starting a family soon. Your relationship with your future grandchildren could be affected by how supportive you are now." The veiled threat regarding grandchildren I hadn't even met yet was the final straw. "Let me tell you about support, Anthony," I said, my voice low but firm. "I worked 60-hour weeks to put Jessica through college without student loans. I depleted my savings to give her the education her mother wanted for her. I've supported her dreams her entire life, often at the expense of my own." I turned to Jessica, whose face had flushed with anger. "I built this house board by board, sweetheart. Your mother and I created this home together. She planted those roses that still bloom every summer. She chose the color of the kitchen walls. Her last moments were spent in the bedroom upstairs. This isn't just property to me. It's the physical embodiment of our life together." "It's just a house, Dad," Jessica shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Just wood and nails. Mom is gone, and she's not coming back just because you cling to this place." The words hung in the air between us, painful in their callousness. "What happens after the wedding, Jessica?" I asked quietly. "After the $150,000 is spent on a 4-day party, will you be happy then? Or will there be another dream to fund?" "The house in Lakeview Estates, private schools for those grandchildren Anthony mentioned. When does it end?" "This is pointless," Anthony interjected. "Clearly, you've made up your mind to be difficult." "Not difficult," I corrected him. "Just realistic about what I can provide without sacrificing my own security and happiness." Jessica was openly crying now, but her tears had turned to rage. "I can't believe you're doing this to me. After I told everyone you were helping us. Do you know how embarrassing this will be?" "I'm sorry you'll be embarrassed," I said sincerely. "But that's not a reason for me to sell my home." "Fine." Jessica grabbed her purse. "Keep your precious house. But don't expect to be part of my life if you can't support the most important day of it. You're dead to me until you change your mind." She stormed out, Anthony following after giving me a cold look. The real estate agent, who had been watching the exchange with obvious discomfort, murmured an apology and quickly left as well. The slam of car doors and the sound of tires on gravel marked their departure, leaving me standing alone in the sudden silence of my living room. The emptiness felt both painful and oddly peaceful. For the first time in months, the pressure was gone. I had made my decision and stood my ground. That night, I sat on Margaret's side of the bed and allowed myself to grieve, not just for the relationship with my daughter that might now be permanently damaged, but for the girl she had once been, the child who had valued the treehouse I built more than any store-bought toy, the teenager who had painted seashells with Margaret during our last family vacation before the cancer diagnosis. When had material things become more important to her than the love and memories we shared? The grief was real and deep, but beneath it lay something unexpected, a sense of relief. I had been true to myself and to the values Margaret and I had built our lives upon. Whatever happened next, I would face it with the integrity that had always guided my choices. The morning after the confrontation, I made a call, not to Jessica, but to Linda Morales, the real estate agent who had first connected me with her financial advisor brother. "Linda, I'm not selling my house," I began, "but I am interested in exploring some other real estate options." "What did you have in mind, Bailey?" she asked. "I want to know about properties in coastal North Carolina. Something small, maybe with a view of the water. A place where a man could fish and work with his hands." Linda sounded surprised but pleased. "I have a colleague in the Outer Banks area. I'd be happy to connect you." Thus began the implementation of what I now thought of as my backup plan, not a retreat from my standoff with Jessica, but an advance toward the retirement I had always dreamed of but repeatedly postponed. I had never told Jessica about the small retirement account Margaret and I had started when we were first married. It wasn't much, just $50 a month set aside faithfully for decades. But with compound interest and careful management, it had grown to a modest sum. Not enough to fund an extravagant wedding, but perhaps enough for a small coastal cottage where I could spend winters away from the Midwest snow. My next call was to Tom Morales, the financial advisor. "I need to know exactly what I can afford without touching the equity in my home or compromising my long-term security." Tom helped me create a realistic budget based on my pension, Social Security, and the retirement account. "You're not wealthy by any means, Bailey, but you're more secure than many people your age. If you're careful, you could make a modest second property work." Within a week, I was looking at listings for small cottages along the North Carolina coast. Most were out of my price range, but a few older properties showed promise. I scheduled a trip to visit them in person, my first real vacation in years. Meanwhile, I began making other changes. I converted Margaret's old sewing room into the workshop I had always wanted, installing proper lighting and building custom storage for my tools. I expanded the vegetable garden, adding a small greenhouse that would extend the growing season. I opened an online store to sell the handcrafted wooden items I created: cutting boards, jewelry boxes, small furniture pieces. These weren't just hobbies. They were investments in my own happiness and potentially additional income sources. Each project felt like a reclamation of dreams long deferred. Through mutual friends, I learned that Jessica and Anthony had drastically scaled back their wedding plans. Instead of Santorini, they were now planning a ceremony at an upscale local venue. The guest list had been cut in half. Jessica had apparently told people that I was being difficult about financial support, casting herself as the victim of my selfishness. What she didn't know was that I had received an invitation to the revised wedding, not from her, but from Diana Parker, who had mailed it with a terse note suggesting my attendance would help smooth over family tensions. The invitation was addressed only to me, with no mention of a +1, despite the fact that I had been seeing Linda Morales socially since our professional relationship had evolved into friendship. I didn't respond to the invitation. Instead, I booked a fishing trip to the Outer Banks for the same weekend as the wedding. If Jessica wanted me at her wedding, she would need to ask me directly, not through her future mother-in-law's manipulative maneuvering. My trip to North Carolina was transformative. The coastal community was small but welcoming, filled with retirees and artists drawn to the natural beauty and slower pace. I looked at several properties with the local real estate agent, but one in particular caught my eye: a weathered blue cottage just 2 blocks from the beach, with a small yard and a detached shed perfect for converting into a workshop. At $180,000, it was at the upper limit of what I could afford. But as I stood on the screened porch listening to distant waves and smelling salt air, I felt a sense of rightness I hadn't experienced since Margaret was alive. "I'd like to make an offer," I told the agent. Using the retirement account Margaret and I had built together, I put down 30%, financing the rest with a 15-year mortgage that would stretch into my 80s. It was a risk, but a calculated one that still left my primary home untouched as a safety net. Back in the Midwest, I began preparing my house for extended absences, installing a security system, arranging for neighborhood teenagers to mow the lawn and check on things, organizing my workshop so Projects could be easily resumed after time away. The plan was to spend winters in North Carolina and summers at my original home, essentially giving myself the best of both worlds. I was in the backyard setting posts for a new garden fence when my phone rang with Jessica's number. We hadn't spoken since the confrontation 2 months earlier. I answered with trepidation. "Is it true?" she demanded without greeting. "Aunt Carol said you bought a beach house." Carol was my sister, who lived in Arizona. I hadn't told her about the cottage, which meant word had traveled through other family channels. "It's not a beach house," I corrected. "It's a small cottage near the ocean in North Carolina. You told me you couldn't afford to help with my wedding, but you had money for a vacation home?" Her voice trembled with anger. "I told you I couldn't afford to sell my primary residence to fund your wedding," I clarified. "The cottage is a modest investment for my retirement, purchased with money your mother and I set aside specifically for that purpose over 40 years. So you chose a second home over my wedding. It wasn't a question, but an accusation. I chose my future over an expense I consider excessive. There's a difference." The line went quiet for so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally, she spoke again, her voice smaller. "The wedding is in 3 weeks. Diana asked if you're coming. I received the invitation she sent. I notice it didn't come from you." Another pause. "Will you be there?" It was the perfect opportunity to tell her about my fishing trip, to create the same kind of hurt she had inflicted on me. But 40 years of putting her first was a habit not easily broken. "Do you want me there, Jessica? Really want me there? Not just for appearances?" Her answer, when it came, was honest at least. "I don't know." After we hung up, I sat on the half-built garden fence and considered the complexity of love and boundaries. Jessica was still my daughter, the child Margaret and I had raised together. But she was also an adult, making choices I couldn't support, values I couldn't endorse. The backup plan I had created wasn't just about securing my own future. It was about establishing a new relationship with Jessica based on mutual respect rather than expectation and obligation. Whether she would eventually understand this remained to be seen. For now, I had a garden fence to finish, a workshop full of projects, and a coastal cottage waiting for me to make it a home. For the first time in decades, I was living life on my own terms, and it felt right. Winter came early that year with a November snowstorm that blanketed my property in 8 inches of pristine white. I packed my truck with tools, clothes, and a few precious mementos, including a photograph of Margaret in the garden and the first birdhouse Jessica and I had built together when she was 7. It was time to try out my new seasonal lifestyle, spending the cold months at my coastal cottage. The drive to North Carolina took 2 days, the landscape gradually changing from snow-covered farmland to the more temperate coastal plains. Arriving at the blue cottage felt like stepping into a new chapter of my life. The place needed work, paint, minor repairs, proper furniture, but that was part of the appeal. I would shape it with my own hands, just as I had my primary home. Those first few months by the ocean were both challenging and rewarding. I established a routine, mornings spent walking the beach collecting interesting pieces of driftwood, afternoons in the shed I was converting to a workshop, evenings on the screened porch with a book, or talking with neighbors who became friends. I launched my online woodworking business, selling handcrafted items made from local wood and the driftwood I collected. Nothing extravagant, cutting boards, coasters, small decorative pieces, but enough to supplement my income and keep my hands busy. To my surprise, the business grew steadily, with repeat customers and positive reviews. Jessica's wedding came and went without my attendance. I sent a card with a check for $5,000, a generous gift by normal standards, though far less than she had originally demanded. Frank attended and reported back that it had been nice enough but nothing special. Jessica and Anthony had apparently argued during the reception about the scaled-back arrangements, a detail that gave me no pleasure to hear. Christmas brought a card from Jessica with a formal wedding photo enclosed. No personal note, just her and Anthony's printed names and a generic holiday greeting. I displayed it on my cottage mantel nonetheless, next to Margaret's picture and photos of my new coastal life. As winter turned to spring, I returned to my Midwest home to find the garden awakening and Margaret's roses budding. The house welcomed me back like an old friend, familiar, and comfortable. I realized then that my backup plan had evolved into something better than I expected, not just financial security, but a rich, dual life that gave me both the comfort of my longtime home and the adventure of my coastal retreat. Through it all, I worked on myself as diligently as I worked on my properties. I joined a grief support group in the coastal town, finally addressing the loss of Margaret that I had buried beneath years of focusing on Jessica's needs. I made new friends in both locations, expanding my world beyond the narrow focus of work and family that had defined most of my adult life. The real test came 6 months after the wedding. I was back in my Midwest home, tending to Margaret's roses, when a car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. Jessica stepped out alone, looking thinner and more subdued than I remembered. "Dad," she said simply, standing awkwardly by her car. "Jessica." I set down my garden shears. "This is a surprise." She glanced around at the property, noting the improvements I'd made, the expanded garden, the new workshop visible through the open garage door, the fresh paint on the porch trim. "The place looks good," she offered. "Thank you. Would you like to come in?" Over coffee at the kitchen table where she had done homework as a child, Jessica gradually revealed the purpose of her visit. The lavish lifestyle she and Anthony had been maintaining was collapsing under its own weight. Credit card debt, the mortgage on a house they couldn't really afford, social obligations to Anthony's wealthy colleagues. It was all becoming unsustainable. "Anthony's been passed over for promotion twice," she admitted. "He says it's office politics, but I think maybe he's not as good at his job as he believes." I listened without interrupting, noting how she avoided directly asking for money, even as she described their financial troubles. Whether this showed growth or just a new strategy was unclear. "What are you planning to do?" I finally asked. She twisted her wedding ring, a gesture reminiscent of how Margaret used to fidget when anxious. "I don't know. Anthony thinks we should just take on more debt to maintain appearances until his career takes off. But you're not sure that's wise?" I finished for her. She nodded, looking up with eyes that suddenly seemed clearer, more like the daughter I remembered. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the difference between wants and needs, about building something real versus creating an impression." It wasn't an apology, but it was something close to understanding. We talked for another hour, mostly about practical financial steps she could take. I didn't offer money, and surprisingly, she didn't ask for any. As she prepared to leave, she paused by the door. "Frank told me about your cottage and your woodworking business. He showed me your website." A small smile. "The pieces are beautiful, Dad. Thank you. You should come visit sometime, when you're ready." "I'd like that," she said, and I believed she meant it. That visit marked the beginning of a new relationship between us, not the instant reconciliation of a Hollywood movie, but a slow, sometimes awkward rebuilding based on adult respect rather than parent-child obligation. We spoke more regularly, though our conversations were briefer and more cautious than before. By the following summer, Jessica had convinced Anthony to downsize to a more affordable home. She had also taken a higher-paying job with a different company, showing an independence I hadn't seen in her before. They weren't out of their financial difficulties, but they were facing them more realistically. As for me, I continued my seasonal migration between my two homes, expanding my woodworking business and even teaching classes at a community center near my coastal cottage. I began dating Linda Morales more seriously, enjoying the companionship of someone who respected my boundaries and shared my values. The most profound change, however, was internal. After decades of defining myself primarily as Margaret's husband and Jessica's father, I had finally embraced my identity as simply Bailey, a craftsman, a gardener, a friend, a man living life on his own terms. The lesson I learned through this difficult journey was that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. True love means wanting the best for someone, even when that best involves difficult truths and temporary disappointment. By standing firm against Jessica's unreasonable demands, I had ultimately done more for her growth than if I had capitulated. And by choosing myself after a lifetime of putting others first, I had discovered a fundamental truth. That's when my real life finally began. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between supporting someone you love and protecting your own well-being? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more reflections from a life fully lived. And remember, it's never too late to start putting yourself first. Thank you for listening, and may you find the courage to protect your own dreams while loving others wisely.